Hello, Wendy Wagner here again to continue our inquiry into what is the ego and why should I care. Briefly, as I've said before, the ego is that which stops us or tries to stop us from being the most expanded, exciting, powerful, and creative human that we can possibly be. And the ego is really determined to do that. And so the whole new psychology should really involve studying the ego, studying all its permutations and strategies and learning them extremely well. And that's why I'm doing these videos, because it's for everybody's education, because this is a part that we're not studying that is vitally important. For instance, today I wanted to talk about one of the less obvious aspects of the ego. You know, the fear, hatred, all other forms of suffering are pretty obvious. But this one is not. And this one is fantasy. Fantasy is actually highly destructive. And I'm going to tell you why and give you an example from my own life. Basically, fantasy is the attempt to find pleasure through creating an unreal reality. And it is an improper use of the mind. It is not what we're meant to be doing with our mind, to be fabricating realities and then trying to extricate pleasure from them. So for instance, when I was younger, I would meet some guy and be all super excited about him. And what had happened was in school, actually, I got to be extremely good at fantasy because my classes were so incredibly boring. And I was able to actually put half of my mind in the classroom and be paying attention, and while the other half was heavily fantasizing about boys and sex and all kinds of things. And unfortunately, I got to be so good at it that, like, when I would meet somebody, a guy who I was interested in, my mind would go bananas. And in like the few days between when I would see him again, I would fantasize about what our relationship would be like, when he would kiss me, what it would be like, what would sex be like, you know. And I'd go so far with the fantasies that I was practically divorcing the guy before I even saw him again. So what happened was, when I did see him again, I was completely off track. I had already married the guy and was starting thinking about divorcing him. And that put us completely off, because I would have all these expectations. I would think he was madly in love with me because that's what I had fantasized. It was extremely detrimental to me in the long run. And I want to use that just as an example of how detrimental fantasy is in general for us. You know, the times when we fantasized about what fabulous things we're going to do in some job, for instance. Now, when reality doesn't match our fantasy, then the temptation, the ego temptation, is to find ourselves inadequate. Why didn't you do that? Why didn't you live up to that? What, you know, we have these huge fantasy expectations, and when we don't meet them, we get down on ourselves. So there's another reason why fantasy is not the healthiest thing to do with one's mind. Basically, it's not reality. So we want to stick with reality. Now, I really invite you to just begin noticing when you're fantasizing. I think of all the mind training I've gone through, learning to stop fantasizing was the hardest by far, because I would use it to help myself get to sleep at night, to fill in boring moments, et cetera, et cetera. So I just want to recommend you just carefully watch how often fantasy comes into your life and begin to really appreciate the destructive qualities of it. So this is it for our ego session today, and thank you very much for listening.